You've now reached the final lesson with the supply chain risk focus. We will have one final lesson after this. It'll be the final lesson of the course, where we'll dive specifically into cyber criminal psychology, separate from any specific attack type. In this lesson, we're talking about defense. Let's begin with an uncomfortable truth. Perfect security against supply chain attacks is impossible. You cannot independently verify every vendor's security, or audit every line of code in every dependency, or continuously monitor every service provider's environment, or eliminate all trust relationships without eliminating the functionality those relationships enable. Supply chain attacks exploit necessary trust because complete self-sufficiency isn't practical. This is not defeatism, it's realism. Defense strategies must accept that some level of risk is inherent and focus on managing risk to acceptable levels rather than eliminating it entirely. Effective supply chain defense requires risk-based thinking rather than attempting comprehensive protection. Identify your most critical vendors and dependencies. A vendor with access to your customer database poses different risk than a vendor providing office supplies, obviously. Assess the access and privileges that each vendor has. A managed service provider with administrative access to your network poses greater risk than a software vendor whose application runs in isolation. Evaluate the sensitivity of data that vendors can access. Consider the impact if each vendor were compromised. Focus your defensive resources on the highest risk relationships rather than spreading effort equally across all vendors. Assessing vendor security is difficult but necessary for high-risk relationships. Review security questionnaires and certifications. Request evidence of specific security controls like multi-factor authentication, encryption practices, logging, monitoring, incident response, and security training. For critical vendors, consider commissioning independent security audits or penetration tests to get that deeper assurance than self-reported questionnaires. Review the vendor's security incident history. Have they been breached before? How did they respond? Were they transparent and thorough in remediation? Understand that vendor security assessment is imperfect. Vendors might misrepresent their practices. Security posture can change after assessment, but assessment is still valuable for identifying obvious deficiencies and establishing security expectations. Contracts should include security obligations, specify minimum security standards, require prompt notification of security incidents, and grant audit rights allowing you to verify vendor security controls. Require adequate cyber insurance coverage. Include specific security requirements for handling your data, where it can be stored, who can access it, how it must be protected, and when it must be deleted. These contractual provisions help but are not foolproof. Enforcement during crises is difficult, and contract damages rarely compensate for the full impact of supply chain compromise. Even with trusted vendors, grant only the minimum access necessary for them to perform their functions. If a vendor needs access to specific systems, that's the only place they should get that access, not anywhere else. Time-bound access is great, so the vendor credentials are only valid during scheduled maintenance windows or support sessions, not any other time. Implement just-in-time privileged access requiring approval for sensitive operations rather than granting standing privileges. Network segmentation contains the blast radius of supply chain compromises. Separate your network into zones with different security requirements and access controls. Place vendor access in restricted VLANs that can reach only the systems the vendor needs to access. Prevent lateral movement from vendor access zones to more sensitive areas. This does require investment in network architecture and access management, but it pays dividends by limiting what any single compromise can affect. Monitor vendor access and activity even though it's expected and legitimate. Log all vendor connections. Alert on anomalous vendor behavior. Require vendors to use individual accounts rather than shared credentials. Never share passwords and usernames. Regularly review vendor activity logs looking for patterns that might indicate compromise even if they didn't trigger automatic alerts. Monitoring does not prevent compromise, but it enables earlier detection and response. There's a powerful observation from the security security researcher Bruce Schneier, in his book Beyond Fear, he wrote, "Security is a trade-off. We all make security trade-offs, large and small, consciously or unconsciously, reasoned or badly, every day of our lives. We make trade-offs as individuals when we decide to lock our door in the morning. We make them as a society when we decide how much to spend on police and roads and social programs." Schneier articulates that security is never absolute. It's always a trade-off against cost, convenience, functionality, and other values. This principle applies directly to supply chain security. Perfect supply chain security would require building everything in-house, never trusting external vendors, independently auditing every component. But this would be prohibitively expensive and eliminate the efficiency gains that make vendor relationships valuable. Zero trust principles help defend against supply chain attacks by not automatically trusting even legitimate vendors. Since supply chain compromises are inevitable, having incident response plans specific to these scenarios is critical. Visibility into your supply chain is foundational to managing supply chain risk. Maintain comprehensive inventories of all vendors, service providers, software applications, software dependencies, and supply chain relationships. Create software bills of material. Understand your supply chain's supply chain. Your vendors have their own vendors. As much visibility as you can get enables risk assessment. Diversifying vendors reduces concentration risk from supply chain attacks. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. For managing open source supply chain risk, software composition analysis (SCA) tools provide essential capabilities. Understand the importance of defense in depth because no single security control prevents supply chain attacks, and this requires layered defenses. Each layer provides partial protection. Supply chain security isn't a one-time effort, but requires ongoing attention. And after implementing reasonable controls, you have to accept that there will be some residual supply chain risk remaining. Supply chain security ultimately depends on people making good decisions. Security awareness and training should include supply chain considerations. No amount of technology eliminates the need for people to think critically about supply chain security in their daily work. So we've completed all of our specific attack types sections of the course. To finish off this course, in this last section, we're going to have our next lesson, the final lesson of the course, will be all about the psychology of hackers and cyber criminals.